kind of series here. I think, having thought about this, I would like to continue where we left off last time, which is this Gemara in Masechet Sanhedrin. I want to look at this, and I decided that also, essentially for the sake of brevity, because there's quite a lot of discussion about this in later sources, I think we're going to stick with the Gemara and Rashi, and then I want to look at some other sources, particularly in the Rambam, and if we have time, also in the Ramban. So, of course, we remember the source that we saw back in Masechet Rosh Hashanah that had the machloket between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Nechemia about Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat, and if it was being sung in the Beit HaMikdash in correspondence to this the Yom Shekulo Shabbat, sometime in the future, or is it being sung in correspondence to Shabbat Bereshit? And then we saw that there was a machloket between Rav Katina and Abaye, that Rav Katina went in the Shita of Rabbi Akiva, who understood that, as it says, Amar Rav Katina, we saw this in Rosh Hashanah, but now we're looking at it here, the way it's brought in Masechet Sanhedrin, because there's a little bit more expansion on this discussion here. So we'll pick up from here. Amar Rav Katina, Shit Alfi Shani Havu Alma, V'chad Charuv. So Rav Katina said, the world will exist for 6,000 years, and then it will be in destruction or desolation for 1,000. So we looked last time at this pasuk in context in Yeshayahu, and then we saw Abaye Ma'atrei Charuv. So he agrees with Rav Katina that the world will exist for 6,000 years, but then he says it'll be in destruction for 2,000 years, and he brings a proof from Hosea, Yechayenu miyomayim, v'yom hashlishi yekibenu v'nichya lefanav. So neither of them, I should point out, bring a proof for the basic idea, which is this idea of Shitalfi Shani Habu Alma. It doesn't, nobody brings a proof for that the world exists for 6,000 years, and then this happens. They're just bringing a proof for what happens in the 7th millennium. So everybody assumes that the world's going to exist for 6,000 years. In other words, on this, there apparently is no machloket. And we'll pick up on that theme in a moment. So the Gemara here goes on. It says, Tanya Kabatei de Rav Katina. So there's a braita that we learn that goes like Rav Katina. And this braita says as follows, Kashem sha'ashvi'it mishametet, mishametet shana achat l'sheva shanim, kacha olam mishamet elef shanim l'shivat alefim shana. So the braita says that just like Shvi'it, the 7th year is mishametet 1 year for every 7 years, so the world also is mishamet 1,000 years for every 7,000 years. Shenamar v'niskab Hashem levado bayom hahu. So, first of all, the term mishametet, right? We use this in a halachic sense. Mishametet, that Shvi'it is Mishametet. So what is Shvi'it? What is this Shemitah year Mishametet? What does that mean when we say Shvi'it is Mishametet?
Lies fallow. Is that lies fallow?
Okay, so one of the basic meanings is that it lies fallow. In other words, the Shvi'it is Mishametet for any kind of agricultural work. And it's also mishameted for something else.
There's a not return of the land.
You're thinking of
Yovel.
what's that?
I was thinking of the Yovel.
Yeah, you're thinking of Yovel, and but in terms of this idea of mishametet, it's also mishametet ksafim. In other words, it's a time when all debts are canceled, right? So it has these two meanings. Rashi here says mishamet v'naaseh charav. It's made desolate. So he seems to point to the idea of mishametet in this first sense, that it lies fallow. And he's understanding that just like the Shemitah year, we don't do any work, the land lies fallow. And that's a kind of charev, like it's a kind of state of desolation. And so it is also that that this will happen in the seventh millennium. I noticed when I was looking here in Steinsaltz that second, I must have been looking somewhere else. He doesn't really say. He just says his mishamet umevatel kiyumo umevatel kiyumo et ragil, right? So it umevatel kiyumo et ragil, right? It changes the norm, the seventh year. But okay, we don't have to get into that. It's just that we'll go with this basic idea that Shemitah is connected. That Shemitah is in itself connected the seventh millennium, and this maybe relates better to this idea of Chad Charuv, right? That it's desolate for 1 year. It rings more easily, it sounds like it fits better than what we say about Shabbat. We think of Shabbat as being a rest, but of course, Shemitah is Shabbat Lashem, and it's Shabbat Haaretz. And the way it's expressed is by not working. Now, that's also true of Shabbat Bereshit, right? In other words, we refrain from Malacha, and because Hashem himself refrained from Malacha. So the destruction doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be an active destroying, but there's a passivity that will bring about the destruction of what has come before, possibly. So that's the beginning of the Braita, and then the Braita goes on, right? So it brings this pasuk that we saw that Rav Katina brought. V'niskav Hashem levado bayom hahu, ve'omer mizmor shir yom HaShabbat, yom shekulo Shabbat. So the second proof text for this Braita is from Mizmor shir yom HaShabbat, based on the way Rabbi Akiva understood it, and the way our Mishnah at the end of Tamid understood it, that Yom HaShabbat is Yom Shekulo Shabbat. It's a day that's entirely Shabbat, and this will point to the seventh millennium. Ve'omer ki elef shanim be'enecha ki yom etmol ki ya'avor. Right? That 1,000 years in your eyes is like a yesterday day, a nechne getag, a day that has just passed, because ki ya'avor, because it will pass. So the last pasuk, ki elef shani be'enecha, why is that brought? It's not a trick question.
It's comparing the Yom Shekalo Shabbat with the pasuk in Tehillim.
That one. What's it say?
They both mention Yom, and that one
Okay.
Yom is like a 1,000 years.
Right. In other words, the last proof text, Kelef Shanim B'Enecha, that's actually the basis for this whole concept. That what's the basis for us saying that there's going to be 6,000 years and then another 1,000 years? Because we're talking about the days of the Kadosh Baruch Hu. That's what we get from the last proof text. That's our basic. That's actually at the yesod. This is like at the foundation of this whole concept. That whenever we're talking about the word yom in the context of the Kadosh Baruch Hu, we need to think of it as 1,000 years, presumably 1,000 human years, right? 1,000 years that we would experience. That's one day for the Kadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, so this Breita then goes like Rav Katina. We don't bring another Breita that supports Abaye. So it seems like the Gemara here, as it were, is leaning toward Rav Katina's understanding, which would also fit into the way we understand the Gemara in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, because we have the machloket there between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Nechemia. And even though this is not really a matter of halacha, but we have the general rule that halacha Rabbi Akiva mechaveiro, right? That if Rabbi Akiva is arguing with one other person, then halacha is like Rabbi Akiva. So these sugyot seem to be going in this direction. That goes like Rabbi Akiva, that the idea of Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat is talking about the 7th millennium, that will be a day of Shabbat for Hashem. So then,
Shel?
Yes.
Yes. The whole idea with all this millennium is very strange to me. It's the only place where the Zmanim are measured by using the decimal system. But all the other places, you have the number 7 or 7 times 7, or you measure it with the moon or with the sun. But where does this alafim? This has got something to do with the decimal systems. If they had said 7 to the 7th, something like this, some kind of period, it would be rather huge. So I would understand that it has got something to do with 7. But where do these alafim come from? Alafim is 10 to the 3rd. Just, I have no idea where they took it from.
Well, okay, but here, okay, so I have 2 comments to make, but one of them is that we understand where they get the 1,000 from. It's from this pasuk, Yelav Shanim B'Enecha, right? So they understand that there's such a thing as a yom, and in Breshit it's Vayera Vayiboker Yom Echad, and we understand that the yom of the Kadosh Baruch Hu is 1,000 years. So that's just based on the pasuk. But also in the Torah, we actually, if you think about it, we see other uses, right? So we have 7, but we also have 70. 70 is also a significant number. We also have, we get into other, presumably other kinds of number patterns.
70, which has got to do with the Zmanim, with time.
With time in particular.
Yes, of course there is. The whole Mikra is based on the decimal system. That was the system of the Hebrews. That's okay. But therefore, you also have the Aserta Dibrod and all kinds of things. But you have when you consider the Zmanim, it's never measured in powers of 10. It's always in powers of 7.
I have to think about that. That's an interesting point then. You're saying that we don't see these powers of 10 or decimal kind of system in the context of time. Okay. I don't really have any thing to respond to that right away. I have to think about that. I think it's a really interesting point. Like I say, the basis for it is from here. We see it in this Breita. Right?
No, I know, I understand. I think they took this thing from the Yavanim, and I can't understand because also I'm not sure, but in Mesopotamia, in the, how do you say, Mesopotamia?
Mesopotamian.
Mesopotamia, yes. The system was based on 60, not on 10. No, the Greek had used the system of 10, the decimal system.
Here's the thing.
And the Hebrews also, but not for the time.
So,
I'm not
Paul,
sure.
So Paul, I haven't any proof text from Mikra, from Torah, but we have in the earlier apocalyptic literature in roundabout Daniel and a little bit later. So in the anti-Hellenistic resistance movement from Judaism against the Hellenism, so early, around Hanukkah, we have a proof text about the 10-week apocalypse. So we have this connection with 10 and time earlier than
Hanukkah was during the time of the Greeks already.
So it's after Mikra, after Torah, but we have an earlier trace for this connection between time and 10. So and we don't know enough perhaps about the influences, but I want to say that's earlier than Katina. And the problem is how to connect perhaps the rabbinic literature and the historical experience as basic for the rabbinic literature and this elder apocalyptic literature in the 2nd century before turning point, so roundabout. So we have the problem is what happened between an influence between Torah and reduction of Torah and this early apocalyptic literature. Not an answer for you, but to enlarge the view and the perspective to see the problem.
Here,
so we have this 10 week. We have the idea of 7 week, then the 8th week of Messianic era, and then we have 2,000 years after Messianic time, also about destruction or desolation, and then in the sense of the new world, the new creation. So that's an earlier concept of how to put together this chain of events in future. That's not an answer for you about, not from Mikra, not from Torah. I can't see it also now. Only this proof text from 1 and 1,000.
Let me put it a different way, because I'm not sure, and I mean I don't know. I literally don't know if this is because of some kind of outside influence from other number systems. I would say let's look at it in its own context. So when we read the pasuk in Tehillim, Ki elef shanim beinecha, ki yom etmol, ki yavor. What do we think that means? Do we think that means literally 1,000 years? Or is it a poetic language, right? In other words, in its own context, right? This is right, Tfilah Moshe, right, from the Psukei de Ziman Shabbat. Yisha Elohim Yish HaElohim Adonai Ma'on Ata Hayita Lana B'dor V'dor B'terem Harim Yuladu V'techolel Eretz V'tevel U'meilam Ad Olam Ata El. Okay, so before the mountains were born and before the land was made, and Me'olam V'ad Olam, right? So from eternity to eternity, you are God. So from the very beginning of this parak of Tehillim, it's dealing with this idea of what do we think of time in relationship to God.
Mm-hmm.
when right, so I mean, I would argue that that it's saying that to begin with, God is God is a being who I don't know if I could. I'm not sure exactly how to say it, that he's outside of time. But when we
Outside
talk,
time.
what's that?
Outside time, yes.
I would say it implies that God is outside of time. Right? In other words, by the measures, right? What are the things that we would measure? B'terem harim yuladu. In other words, we look at mountains. I mean, you know, throughout history, man will look at a mountain. They know that this mountain didn't pop up overnight. It's been there from their point of view for an eternity, and exists before that time, and he's to exist after that time. So then, Tasheva no shadaka v'tomer shuva b'nei adam. All right, so it's an exhortation to do tshuva. Ki elef shanim b'yanecha ki yom etmol. So when I this pasuk, ki elef Shuto shel mikra, as I would understand it, is just that time doesn't mean to you what it means to us. 1,000 years to you, we could say it's like a blink of your eye, like it's a blink of my eyes, 1,000 years to you. So if I think of God as a being who's outside of time, then you know, make of that what you will. But it's not the way that humans relate to time. Now, when Rav Katina uses this pasuk, not Rav Katina, when the Braita here uses this pasuk, which clearly Rav Katina has also understood this pasuk. When we're talking about 1,000 years, so we say, Shit Alfi Havi Alma, the world will exist for 6,000 years. So we have to ask ourselves if it's really based on this idea of Ki Elef Shanim Be'enecha, does it also literally mean 6,000 years? Or does it just mean a very long time?
Yes, they take it literally, this pasuk. And,
right. So
the pasuk means something a very long time. For the Kadosh Baruch Hu, it's like one day for a human or something like this. Yeah.
Right. So it seems like they take it literally, but I would also say that with a grain of salt. I don't. We're going to look now at the time of the Be'er Eliyahu. It talks about 6,000 years. I would look at all of this with a grain of salt, and even from their point of view, you know, the question is, what are all these people trying to accomplish? When Rabbi Akiva talks about Yom Shekulo Shabbat, when Rav Katina talks about Shita Alfi Havi Alma Chad Charba, what are they trying to accomplish? Are they actually trying to tell us what will happen in the future? Possibly. Or maybe they're teaching us something about the nature of the world that we live in. Let's get back to that in a moment. So I'm pointing that out, and it doesn't answer your question, Paul, but I just want to point out that even in this context, taking the original context of the pasuk, and even in this context where they seem to put it into this framework where we're going to take it literally as 1,000 years, I would still be careful to understand if they also thought of it in those kinds of literal terms. We get now to Tana Devei Eliyahu. Sheshet Alafim Shana Havi Alma. The world will exist for 6,000 years. Shnei Alafim Tohu, Shnei Alafim Torah, Shnei Alafim B'mot HaMashiach. U'va'avonotenu shirabu yatsu mehem mashiyatsu. Right? And through our sins, which have multiplied, we've lost what had been lost. Like the time from that has gone out, whatever has gone out. So let's try and understand this Braita a little bit better. This Tana Devei Eliyahu, you may all be familiar. There's a midrash that's called what did I do here? Hold on. 1 second. I didn't mean to do that. Wait. This is the Ramban. So I have to go back and open this up again. Oh no, it's here. There we go. There's a midrash, Tana Devei Eliyahu, a collection of midrashim that are attributed to Eliyahu Hanavi. There's an interesting machloket amongst at least the Achronim that I found about whether Tana Devei Eliyahu means that these were things that were learned from Eliyahu Hanavi, or were they learned from a Tana who was just named Eliyahu. If you want, I can give you the references for that. There's a discussion about it in the Yad Malachi, which is a collection of klalim on the Gemara and on Poskim, and the Chida also talks about it. And what I can tell you, it's not 100% clear. The basic term of Tana Devei, I think we've discussed this also, but I'll just put it in context. We have two meanings of the word Tana. Tana either is one of the Rabbanim from the time of the Mishnah, or what's the other meaning of a Tana? A Tana who was at the time of the Amoraim. What was that Tana? Do you remember? I think I brought it up before. There's the idea. A Tana. What does Tana mean? It literally means to repeat. It comes from the word. It's the Aramaic equivalent of the shanot. Litanot is
like academy, or like the school academy, or.
Well, that's the Bay part. Okay. So what's the Tana part? So the Tana used to be that the Amoraim in the Beit Midrash, they would have standing next to them a Tana. A Tana was like a walking library. These were people who memorized Braitot, right? So these things weren't written down. They had people who had trained themselves and had exceptionally good memories. And when the Rav was giving a shir, he would say to his Tana, quote this Braita for me. He would give him the reference, and then that Tana, he would quote it. He would say it. So we have this phrase, Tana Devei. It would be the Tana of the Beit Midrash of Ploni, right? Whoever it is. There's Gemara Masechet Menachot, Tana Devei Rav, that in the house of Rav, there was a Tana who said this. And then you'll see in some places in the Gemara that the Rav will say to the Tana that occasionally they'll reject the Braita that they say. They'll say, no, that's not, that's a Shabeshta, that's a corrupt version, and you have to correct it like this, and so forth. So here it says Tana Devei Eliyahu. So one way of reading is that this was the Tana in the Beit HaMidrash of a Rav whose name was Eliyahu. Another way of understanding it, though, is that the Beit Eliyahu, the Beit Midrash of Eliyahu, was the Beit Midrash of Eliyahu Hanavi, who revealed himself at different times in history to different people. And I'm just pointing out, it's an interesting thing. Now, I'm in no position to say one way or the other, but I do think it's interesting that this Tana Devei Eliyahu comes up in this particular context when we're talking about an apocalyptic subject, right? It's some kind of an end of, or what presumably is a kind of an end of times type. So what does he say? Let's look at Rashi here. Tana Devei Eliyahu Sheshet Alfim Shana Avi Alma, that the world will exist for 6,000 years. Rashi says Havi Alma Ha'olam Kach Mitkayem, right? That the world is going to exist for these 6,000 years, and how are they going to get divided up? There'll be 2,000, 2,000, and 2,000. Beit Alfim Haya Tohu. 2,000. And there's the first 2,000 years was Tohu. They were mistake, like let's say a kind of a disorganized state. And Rashi says Tachat Shelo Nitna Adayin Torah. So the world had not yet received the Torah. The Torah had not yet been given in these first 2,000 years. V'haya ha'olam kid tohu. So the world was like it was in a state of tohu. And then he gives his cheshbon. And Adam Arishon, Ad sheya Avraham ben 52 shana, Ika alpaim shana. From the time of Adam Arishon until Abraham was 52 years old, you get 2,000 years. As you can prove from the psukim. When the first 2,000 years were over, in other words, when Abraham was 52 years old, Asak Abraham Torah. Abraham started to busy himself in Torah. And everybody knows this because Rashi brings this down on his Perush. In the Targuminan, in the Targum there says, V'sha'abidu li'oraita b'charan. Right? That Abraham had the, 1 second. Right. Vaikach Avram et Sarai ishto v'yadlod ben achiv v'yad kol rechusham asher rachashu v'et hanefesh asher asu b'charan. Right. So he takes his household and his nephew and so forth, and the nefesh, the souls that he made in Haran. Vayitzu l'lechet artze Canaan v'yavo artze Canaan. So of course the question is who is the nefesh asher asu b'charan? So the Targum says, it's the people that he, as it were, enslaved to the Torah. In other words, he was teaching Torah to people, and so he made them into his souls, as it were. He made their souls. Yamrina b'masechet avodah zarah gemiri dahahu sha'ata Avram bar chamshin v'tartei. We learned from the Gemara and Masechet Avodah Zarah that at that point, when he goes to Canaan, he was 52 years old. So Rashi's laying this out. He's explaining why we consider the first 2,000 years to be tohu, because the world, nobody was busying themselves with Torah. But then Abraham starts to busy himself with Torah. That's the beginning of the third millennium, the end of the first 2,000 years. Then Ushnei Alafim Torah. So then we have 2,000 years of Torah. So I'll go through this. I'll be honest with you. I didn't do all of the calculations here. I'm going to trust Rashi that they're all correct. But it's always interesting. I always check these things when I go through them. But it says Ishnei Alfim Torah. So from Mina Nefesh Asher Asu B'charan, it was from that time when Avram was 52 years old, Ad Alpayim Shnot HaMashiach, 40 Shana, Ad Shnolad Yitzchak, ו-60 שנה משנולד יצחק עד שנולד יעקב, הרי ק"ח, right? So that's 108. So 40, so that's why the Shmonim is in parentheses here. So he says, so how do we get this next 2,000 years? So Rashi's actually going to lay out what happened in the next 2,000 years, which are the next 2,000 years of Torah. So from the time that Avram is 48, from the time he's 52, then you count another 48 years until Yitzchak is born, right? Because he's born when Avram's 100. The Shishim Shana Mishnolad Yitzchak ad Shnolad Yaakov. You add another 60 years to the 48. So you get to when Yaakov was born. So that's 108 years from the beginning of this millennium. The Kuf Lamed, 130, Shayuli Yaakov, Kishabala Mitzrayim. Yaakov was 130 years when he got to Mitzrayim. Harei Resh Lamed Chet. So that's 238 years so far. We would do, right, the 210 years. I'm sorry, the 410 years. I'm sorry, 210 years. The do is 210 years. Shamdu b'Mitzrayim, that they were in Mitzrayim. Hare Taf Mem Chet. So that's 448, right? It's 210 plus 338. It's 448. Umishi Atsumi Mitzrayim Achinibne Bait Rishon. Taf Pei. That's 480. That's Mufurash in the Pasuk in Malachim. Because there it says, "Ahi b'shmonim shana ve'arba me'ot shana letzeit b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim." That was when the first Beit HaMikdash is built, 480 years from the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim. So we add 480 to our 448. Hare taf taf kuf kaf chet, right? So that's 1,028. The Taf Yud, 410, Shamad Bayit Rishon. The first temple stood for 410 years, which Rashi doesn't have to bring the proof for. If you count out, if you go through Sefer Malachim and you count out how long everyone lived, you'll come up with 410 years. By the way, in parentheses, that's a bit of a fuzzy number because depends. It'll also depend how you count, but that's what's mikubal. That it's based on those readings. You'll get to that 410. Hare taf taf kuf. So that gives us 500. I'm sorry, I skipped. Taf yud shamad bayit rishon kan mufik al pi cheshbon shon tamachim. The shivim de galut. Right, that's in the Psukim, right? That's based on the Nebuah of Yirmiyahu. Shivim de Galut Bavel. The Taf Kaf 420 Shamad Bayit Sheni, which is also a tradition. Hare Taf Taf Kuf. So that gives us 500 plus the 1,028. Hare Alpine. So it gives us 2,000 less 172. Kuf ayin bet, kodem hashlamat dalad alafim nechrav habayit. So 172 years before the end of the fourth millennium, the second Beit HaMikdash is destroyed. Ulosof otan kuf ayin bet, at the end of that 172 years after the destruction, Nishlamu Shnei Alafim Torah. That was the end of the 2,000 years of the Torah. That's Tanu Devei Eliyahu was talking about. Ba'aydu da'amar Shnei Alafim Tohu. So by way of it saying, since it started off with the idea that there's 2,000 years of Tohu, Ka'amar Shnei Alafim Torah. That's why it also talks about 2,000 years of Torah. It doesn't mean to say that the Torah ended at the end of 2,000 years. Memresh is Mipi Rabbi. This is a Kabbalah that Rashi had from one of his teachers. Anyway, it's an interesting thing, and I'll reference this again a little bit later. So the idea, so what's Rashi's idea? What does it mean 2,000 years of Torah? If I were to summarize this, I know I did it a little bit choppily, so I apologize. But what's Rashi getting at with 2,000 years of Torah?
We have the building and the continuation of the two Beit Mikdash.
Right. So in other words, it started. In other words, the 2,000 years of Torah start with Avraham Avinu, which is where, from Chazal's point of view, that's where Torah starts. Even though Matan Torah doesn't come about for another long time, right, for a few hundred years, but Chazal understood that Avraham Avinu kept the entire Torah, and that he's, as it were, the introduction of Torah into the world in some way, and then beginning from that time until the destruction of the temple, the second temple, that's this whole period that we think of as Torah. This is because during that time we actually get the Torah, we have the Tkufa of the Nevi'im, we have all of the Ketuvim, we have the Torah Shabbal Peh that's going throughout this time, and actually continues, even past that time. But I think what Rashi is trying to point out is that the dominant theme of most of that 2,000-year period is the receiving of the Torah and the implementation of the Torah in the form of the people living in Eretz Yisrael with a Beit HaMikdash, right? Which is the point of getting the Torah.
Shel,
yes.
Is our counting of the years 5,782? Is this based on this calculation of Rashi, or is that?
It's not based on Rashi alone. Rashi's basing it on. It's ultimately based on the way we count time from Breshit. That's why.
That's what Rashi does. No, I think so.
Yeah, but Rashi's not the first one to do it. There's the book that does it, I think, most famously before Rashi is the Seder Olam, which Rashi refers to. And I have a copy of it. Anyone's interested, you can download it from HebrewBooks.org. And the Seder Olam was there is more than one of these books, but Seder Olam is one of the more widely accepted ones, where he actually goes through like the history of the world as we understand it, giving us the year, like a year by year, as close as we can, blow by blow, year by year, what happened, who lived when, and for how long did they live. Most of the Seder Olam in that regard is based on psukim and certain traditions. But like you see what Rashi's doing here, and of course, if you've learned Rashi, especially in Breshit, he does this same kind of calculation in Breshit, like when he explains how Rivka was 3 years old when she married Yitzchak, he gives that cheshbon. There's all these cheshbonot that Rashi gives that are based on they're all based on this idea of trying to take, if you take the minimal understanding of the years as they're presented in Tanakh, these are the cheshbonot that you will come up with.
So Rashi is quoting this Seder Olam. This is what you mean?
I don't know if he's quoting this. I didn't go to check. I don't know if he's quoting the Seder Olam here, but his basic methodology is the same methodology as the Seder Olam. And that's also what we write in shtarot, right? This is what we write in nowadays in a ketubah or in a get. We say 5,782 livriat olam, right? Because as you may remember from the beginning of Rosh Hashanah, there were different ways of dating shtarot. You could date them also by the year of the reign of the king, but it became minhag to, right, and that's a whole big discussion in the beginning of Rosh Hashanah, because one of the, right, Rosh Hashanah, there is such a thing as Rosh Hashanah l'Melachim. Nisan is a Rosh Hashanah l'Melachim, meaning, right, that if the king came into power just in Adar, even in the end of Adar, that's all counted as a whole year, because beginning Nisan, he'll be counted as second year. Anyway, the idea is that it became the minhag for Jewish shtarot to write them according to the years of the existence of the world as we perceive it. And that's based on our understanding of these kinds of calculations. If you go through Tanakh, the idea, I think in a way, it's arguably a little bit easier when you go through Sefer Melachim to make these calculations, because there's a kind of a consistency in the way deaths are reported and how many years people live. The reason, in my mind, that these dates have always been at least a little bit fuzzy is because when you say that so and so is such a, like was so many years when they died, but if we don't know exactly what their birth date was, we, when you start counting from that year to the next time, we don't know if we're counting, half a year or a whole year. Like, should we, you know what I'm saying? It's not 100% clear to me, but this is how it was done, right? So basically, I think the basic rule of, and I'm not sure about this, I think the basic rule of thumb is that you just always round up to the, to that nearest year. 2000.
Shel, can I interrupt for a second? I wanted to share something that our rabbi's been talking about the last few weeks. He's been talking about, it's part of his Pirkei Avot shiur, but the last 2 weeks he talked about this issue of 2000, 2000, and 2000, and he pointed out that, like you said earlier, Avraham Avinu, but he also pointed out that at the end of the second 2000 years was Rebbe. And however, it's not clear whether Rebbe is part of the end of the 4,000 years or the beginning of the next 2,000. And he particularly pointed out the relationship between Rebbe and Tininus, the Roman emperor. Right. And Rebbe, of course, is the descendant of Bnei Yisrael, Bnei Yaakov, and Tininus is the descendant of Bnei Adam, Bnei Esav. And so now that this relationship is maybe a beginning of a reconciliation, and maybe it belongs to the last 2,000 years. And of course, the redaction of the Mishnahs, the end of the Torah, there's a lot there, but he's been talking about this the last few weeks, so it just jumped out at me.
Oh, very good. Very interesting. Yes, right. Rebbe famously was friends with Antoninus. I've actually read different things about who exactly Antoninus was. I don't think he was the emperor, but he was probably...
Yeah, not the emperor, but the governor of Palestine. And yes.
He seemed to be the governor at the time, right? And they had this very close relationship. In fact, it's in this sugya here in Sanhedrin. The Rebbe says that he learned 3 things from Antoninus. It's very interesting. I think it's just a few dapim earlier he has this exchange. And there are other exchanges in different parts of Chazal that are recorded. Very, very interesting. Very interesting. So then we get to the last, as it were, the last 2,000 years of Shnei in Shnot HaMashiach. 2,000 years are the years of the Mashiach. So Rashi says what that means is Shlachar Shnei Alafim Torah Hava Dino Sheyavo Mashiach. What does it mean it's 2,000 years of Mashiach? It's during this last 2,000 years by din, right, that, by rights, as it were, this is a time when Mashiach will come or should come. The Tichlei Galut will be over. Yivatel Hashiabud Yisrael, and the enslavement of Israel will be canceled. Right? That's based on Gemara elsewhere, which we'll get to later, but you're probably familiar. There's a Ma'amar of Shmuel that says, Ein ben olam hazeh liyemot Mashiach ela shi'abud malchuyot bilvad. There's no difference between our times now and the times in the Mashiach, except for the enslavement of other nations, other kingdoms. All right, so that's the last 2,000 years.
Shel,
Yes.
Yeah. That's a fantastic idea. So, to say after, okay, that's clear, the event, but the idea seems to be the coming of the Mashiach is 2,000 years. So what does that mean? So we have the long period, and so think about and parallelism of Christianity. So it's very, very interesting to say, okay, we have this Jesus, and this is Messianic time, but here we see, we have 2,000 years of Biat Mashiach coming. So that's a very, very fantastic idea. Perhaps rabbinic literature reacted and say, okay, my beloved Christian, we have also this idea of the coming of the Mashiach about 2,000 years. That's great.
Yeah, I mean, It's possible. I think it's yeah. I mean, first of all, yeah, that's possible. I'm always a little wary about how much these things are reactions to.
Yeah, okay, but
But
without
nonetheless,
Christianity, leave it on the side, the Christianity.
we'll leave it on the side. But no, it reminded me. And I thought if I'll tell you this maybe at the end. Maybe I'll people want to hang about because I wanted to talk to you about what you sent me from Professor Friedman and something that I heard in his name, which is actually kind of pertinent to what you're saying. But nonetheless, actually, the Gemara here, so here, let's finish this off and then I'll read a little bit further on, just because you mentioned this. So this is the end of the Bright of Tana de Be'eliyahu. And it says, and through our sins, that we're so many, through our many sins, Yatsu mehem Mashiatsu. And Rashi says, Aval bishvil avotenu shirabu lo ba Mashiach l'sof arbat alafim. Because, in other words, beginning at the end of the fourth millennium, that was the time when it was ra'ui for the Mashiach to come. That's the time when Mashiach could have come, but the Mashiach didn't come at the end of the 4,000 years. Yatsu Mashiatsu she'adayin hu mu'kav labo. So the years that have gone by because he is still being held back from coming. But it introduces this idea that this is the time that's ra'ui for the Mashiach to come. Now, I'll read a little, before I read a little bit.
Isn't he doing chishuvei kitzin, a thing which is not allowed?
So actually, the source for that idea, mechashvei kitz, is here. It's actually on this. It's on this amud. It's a little bit further down because, and I dafka want to talk about this. This is, but I'll skip to it and then we'll go back. Right, that the different ways of translating it, but it means like the people who try to figure out the end of days, they should be cursed, or they themselves should be blown up, or however you want to understand it. In other words, it's a clear statement saying that this is not something that you should be doing. And he says, "Shayu omrin kevan shigia taketz v'lo ba shuv eino ba." Right, because people would say, right, when that time comes and then it didn't work. Somebody predicted that the Mashiach is going to come, or the end of days is going to come, and then that time passes. Shuv eino ba, people say, so it's not going to happen. Ela chakelo, rather you should wait for it. Shneimar im yitmamea chakelo. Shema tomar anu mechakin v'hu eino mechaken. Talmud lomar l'chein yichakeh Hashem l'chinanechem l'chein yarom l'rachnechem. Okay, so this is a separate thing, and I'm going to show you. I'll show you in a moment a little bit from the Rambam when he talks about this in at least a couple of places. But because since we're here already, and since Shira mentioned what she did, let's just read a little bit further from the top of the Amud. It says, Amarle Eliyahu. Here it says Eliyahu bin Furash. Eliyahu said to Rav Yehuda, Achu the Rav Salah Chasida. Eliyahu said to Rabbi Yehuda, who was the brother of Rav Salah Chasida, he said, Ein ha'olam pachot mishmonim v'chamisha yovlot. The world doesn't exist for less than 85 yovlot. So that's 85 50s, it's 4,250 years. V'yovel ha'acharon ben David ba. In the last yovel, the Mashiach will come. Amar le, so Rav Yehuda said to Eliyahu, B'tfilato u'basofo. Is he going to come at the beginning of that yovel or the end of that yovel? Amar le, he said, Eini yodea. I don't know. Kala or eino kala? Will it be like the whole yovel, or maybe the yovel won't finish? Sounds like he's asking him in a slightly different way. Amarle any yodea, I don't know. So Ravashi, so this would be later. Ravashi says Amar Hachi Amarle. This is what he said to him. Ad hacha lo tistachile. Mukan ve'elach istachile. It means that before this last Yovel, until this last Yovel, you should not expect the Mashiach. But after that, you should expect. Right? Rashi says here, Ad hacha lo tistachile, ad Yovel hacharon lo titzapelo, divadai lo yavo kodem hasmanise. Right? So you shouldn't expect him to come before this. So again, it ends off in this kind of, there's nothing definite here. There is this indication. So there are a couple of things that I wanted to throw in here. One of them is exactly this question that Paul mentions. Just a second. Oh, Michael Warner is joining us for the last bit. Let's just wait a second until he connects. Hello, Michael Werner. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, belatedly.
Yes, well, we're at sort of a transition point, so I'm going to jump right into it. So one of the places where the Rambam talks about this question of the end of days, I mentioned one before, where he gives his opinions about what Yemot HaMashiach means and what Olam Haba means. That's at the beginning of Perek Chelek in the Perusha Mishnayot. He has a very long introduction to that Perek, and he talks there about these issues. But one of the other places where he talks about this in particular is at the end of the Mishnah Torah, in the end of Sefer Melachim. Hilchot Melachim. So let's just read this. Al ya'aleh alev shebiyamot HaMashiach yibatel davar miminhago shel olam. You shouldn't think that in the time of the Mashiach that the world is going to behave, right? That anything from the way the world is conducted normally is going to be canceled. Or yesham chidush b'ma'aseh breshit, or there'll be some innovation in the actual creation. The world is going to continue to function the way it's functioned until now. And maybe you're going to ask me a question from this pasuk in Yeshaya. When Yeshayahu talks about the wolf with the lamb and the tiger with the gdi with the kid, that they'll lie down together, that's a mashal and a chida. It's an allegory. Inyan hadavar shiyu Yisrael yoshvin levetach im rishei akum amshulim kizei v'namer. Rambam says he tells you what he thinks it means. It means that Israel is going to be able to dwell in security with those people, the evil people who had been of Avodah Zarah, where they are elsewhere in Tanakh compared to these chayot torfot, right? These wild animals. Shinemar, Ze'ev aravot yishadadeim v'namer shoker areihem. And in Yirmiyahu, the context there, it's not talking about an actual wolf or an actual namer. It's talking about Rishaim who are Odei Avodah Zarah. Yachzeru kulam l'data amet. All of these people who are Odei Avodah Zarah, they will return to the true dat. V'lo yigzelu v'lo yashchitu. They will no longer steal. They will no longer destroy. Elo yochlu davar hamutar benachat im Yisrael. They will consume that which is permitted to them in peace, in ease with Israel. Shenemar v'aryeh kabakar yochal teben. That the lion, like cattle, will eat straw. In other words, again, also Rambam is saying that's a mashal, it's a chida, it's an allegory. All of these other references that you're finding in Navi, they're all allegory. Eventually, in other words, if you're zocheh to see the Yemot HaMashiach, that's when you're going to understand all of the allegory. Ma'inyan and Ma'inyan Ramzu b'zeh. What was the matter that was hinted at in these different psukim? Bet Amru Chachamim ein bein ha'olam hazeh Yemot HaMashiach el shibud malchuyot bilvad. Right. This is also in our sugya that earlier in our sugya on Sanhedrin, and it's also mentioned in the Gemara on Shabbat, that there's no difference between this world, in other words, the way we exist now and the times of the Messiah, except shibud malchiyot, that we will not be enslaved by kingdoms. Right. That's the only difference. This is shown from the simple words, the plain understanding of the words in the Nevi'im, of the prophets. Right? This, at the beginning of that time, there's going to be an actual war of Gog and Magog. Before that time, a Navi will arise to straighten Israel and to ready their hearts and get them ready. So forth, right? Which he's going to quote the rest of the pasuk in a moment. Eliyahu Navi is going to come before this great day. Rambam understands that means before Yemot HaMashiach. And what is he going to do? Just a second. Ve'eshiv lev avot al banim, ve'lev banim al avotam, kenavo v'hiketzi et ha'aretz cherem. Right. So the purpose of Eliyahu Hanavi coming is to settle, as it were, the hearts of the fathers on the sons, and vice versa. Lest, and that needs to be done, lest there be some other kind of destruction in its wake. So that's the idea of Eliyahu coming, and that's what the Rambam is saying. He comes there to prepare us for this time. He's not coming to paskin, as it were. He's not coming to tell us that which is tameh is tahor, that which is tahor is tameh. He's not going to come and tell us the yichus of different people. Right, but rather to put peace in the world. And some Chachamim say that before Biyat HaMashiach, Eliyahu is going to come. Now here's where he lets you know what he really thinks. Nobody really knows how this is going to play out. These are things that are closed. In other words, because the Nevi'im spoke in remez, and they spoke in allegory, and they spoke in chidah, we don't know exactly what they saw and what they were trying to transmit. And there wasn't a special tradition that the Chachamim had about this. They themselves were trying to figure it out by looking at these psukim and trying to understand what they can glean from the psukim. That's why, in fact, there's machloket about these psukim and what they imply. But nonetheless, and this is one of the things the Rambam really wants to emphasize. This is not the principal part of the religion. You shouldn't busy yourself with these Haggadot. I don't think the Rambam means you shouldn't learn Midrashay Haggadah, but he means this is not where you should be dwelling on in an effort to figure out exactly how this is all going to pan out. Right? The Rambam, by the way, in his Hakdama to Perek Chelek, he talks about Midrash and allegory and Midrash, and he points out that the Chachamim, just like the Nevi'im, spoke Bechida, and he even says that he wants to write a book to explain Midrash, which he didn't actually end up doing, although he does talk to some, not a small degree, about it in the Moreh Nevuchim. And his son, the Rabbeinu Avram, wrote a very long introduction to understanding Midrash, which is printed at the beginning of the Ein Yaakov for anybody who's interested. In any event, but all of these things that we're talking about, lo yisimei mikar, this should not be the main thing that you should be focused on. She'ein mevi'in lo lidei yira, this is a very interesting thing. They don't bring to yirat Hashem v'lo lidei ahava, not to ahavat Hashem. That's what he's talking about, yira and ahava, which the Rambam counts among the very first of his mitzvot, yirat Hashem and ahavat Hashem. He says, focusing on these end of days kinds of issues, they're not going to bring you to Yirat Hashem or Avat Hashem. You shouldn't try to calculate the end of times. And this is the Gemara that we just saw in Sanhedrin. Tipach rucham shemachashvei hakitzim. You should just wait, and you should believe in general these concepts as we explained. And he explained this elsewhere, and he talks about this elsewhere, but this is what the Rambam felt about these things. Now, I'm going to show you one other reference in the Rambam, and if you want, I can cut and paste this for you. One of the famous igrot of the Rambam is the Igeret Teiman. And the Igeret Teiman was written, actually I looked this up today, it was written actually during the time that the Rambam was in the middle of writing the Mishneh Torah. I think literally in the middle. It was like, apparently it took the Rambam 10 years to write the Mishneh Torah. And this was somewhere about halfway through. He was approached he got a letter from the head of the Kihila in Teiman, describing the kinds of pressures they were under. They were under pressure from the Islamic rulers. And the Rambam writes a very long response to them to try to bolster their spirits and to tell them that they should continue carrying on with their Judaism, even if they have to do it in hiding. And he talks about, and at that time there was another Rav who had predicted the coming of a Mashiach. And it's one of the reasons the Rambam goes into this in the Igeret Teiman. This is, what I have here is just the basic text, but in the, and I know there's another more recent edition, but I have the Musada Rav Kook edition, has a lot of notes, and they explain a lot of the history. But I'll just mention here, he goes into this in particular. The Rambam says, so Rav Sadia Gaon, in fact, was a Mechashev Kates. He was one of the people who tried to predict a particular time when Mashiach was going to come. And of course, the Rambam, even though he didn't always agree with Rav Sadia, had the highest esteem of Rav Sadia. He held him to be, one of the great Gaonim of that time, of the time of Rav Sadia. So here, Rav Sadia was in the Mechashev Kates. So he says, the first thing you need to know is first of all, you should know no person is can ever know the exact time of the gates of the end of days. Kamoshe Be'er Daniel V'Yamar, Daniel himself said, Kistumim v'chatumim advarim ad eight gates. These things, in other words, the visions that Daniel had, which seemed to indicate, what was going to happen. He was told that those things are going to be closed and sealed until they come. אבל רוב ציור קצת החכמים על זה ועלה ברעיוניהם שהשיגו כבר קדם הנביא להודיע עניין זה ויאמר ישוטטו רבים בתרבה הדעת. Other people who've tried to come up with these kitzim, right? Nevi'im already said that these are people going to wander around and there are going to be a lot of opinions. Like he said at the end of what we saw at the end of Hilchot Melachim. כבר באר הקדוש ברוך הוא על ידי נביאיו שקצת בני אדם יחשבו קיצים למשיח ויעברו הקיצים ולא יתקיימו. Right? That's the Gemara that we just saw. That indicates this idea that people are going to be machashvei kates and then that time is going to go past. But we are also warned not to be in doubt about this thing. Yamar, al yatzivu etchem im lo ya'aleh cheshbonam, aval kol ma sheyosif lehitacher hosifu bo tikva. Right? Maybe your cheshbon didn't work out, but the longer it takes, you should just add on more hope or more expectation. Sheken amar in Chabakuk, Yod chazon l'moed v'yipach l'ketz v'lo yichazeh v'yitvameach hakelo bo yavo lo yacher. תדע שהקץ שביאר הקדוש ברוך הוא אותו בביאור, כלומר גלות מצרים, שאמר ועבדו ועינו אותם 400 שנה. See, it goes back, and this is actually one of the themes that I wanted to leave us thinking about. When we're talking about these kitzim and Ketzim Ota Mashiach and so on and so forth, we're talking about the Gula Latid Lavo. So there's always going to be this idea that we had an initial Gula, which is Yitziat Mitzrayim, and then we will have a final Gula, which will be Yemot HaMashiach. And Chazal make this, they compare these things, most particularly off the top of my head, at the end of the first parak of Brachot. This is the machloket between Rabbi Yozar ben Azariah and the Chachamim about you may it's in the Haggadah. Yimei chayecha hayamim, kol yimecha hayecha halaylot. Right? The Chachamim are mean yimei yimecha lamazeh, kol yimei chayecha lavi limot HaMashiach. That machloket is a machloket about, are we still going to be talking about the Geula of Mitzrayim at the time of the final Geula? So the Rambam here makes an interesting comparison. He says, it's not just this final Geula that's so unclear. Even the first Geula was not clear because Avram Avinu was told, "Va'avadu v'inu otam 400 shana, lo noda'a mitato v'nafal bo safek." The truth of that Avram was told that his offspring was going to be enslaved and they were going to be afflicted for 400 years. It's not clear that even Avram knew exactly what that meant. How do you count the 400 years? Some people try to calculate it from the time that Yaakov went down to Egypt. Some people count it from the time that Bnei Israel are enslaved. That's 70 years after Yaakov went down to Mitzrayim. Some people say no, it goes all way back to the Brit Ben HaBtarim itself. That's when you count 400 years. 400 למעמד בין המתרים יצאו ממצרים קצת בני ישראל. At the end of that 400 years, some of the children of Israel actually did leave. Kodem Shamad Moshe Rabbeinu Shoshim Shana, 30 years before Moshe Rabbeinu got up. Because they thought that that was the end of this time that was promised to Abraham, and they left. And those people who left, who tried to escape Mitzrayim 30 years before Moshe arose, they were actually killed by the Mitzrayim, and the Shiabud became even worse. If that's a midrash, I think, if I remember, I didn't look it up for this, so I think it's Bnei Ephraim, some of the Bnei Ephraim who escaped, and before they could get to Eretz Canaan, they were killed by the Mitzrayim. Amar David, Bnei Ephraim, I think it was from this pasuk, Bnei Ephraim noshkei romei keshet taflu biyom krav. Okay. It really was 400 years from the birth of Isaac, etc. I don't have to read the whole thing. If anybody wants, I can send you this whole thing. And the Rambam does eventually get up to this point where he says, the people who tried to tell you the end of times, that's a stumbling block to people. Chachamim prayed that they wouldn't be paid attention to, in so many words. And so then in the end he says, but nonetheless we're going to judge Rav Saadia favorably, and we'll say what brought him to make his own cheshbon, even though he knew that the Torah forbade making these kinds of calculations. He knew that a lot of people in his time were making false calculations. That the Torah itself might have been lost except for him. Because he revealed that which had been hidden in the Torah. Right? He was a great teacher of Torah. He saw it as a kind of an organizing principle. That what Rambam says that the real reason that Rav Saadia did what he did was just to focus people on the real thing, which is Torah. But I'm definitely paraphrasing the Rambam here, but Rambam understood that Rav Saadia basically wanted to give these people hope, and he wanted to focus them on the real thing, which is to learn Torah. So by giving them this idea of the case, they were able then to focus on what he was there to do, which was to reveal the understanding of the Torah to them. So he defends Rav Saadia in this regard. But we know that even after the Rambam, people still continued to do this, and there's a lot to be said about it. We're almost at the end, and before I finish, we're not going to go through this, but anyone who is interested, I mentioned these before, a lot of what we did today, looking at this Gemara, you can see the Ramban gives his spin that's based, a lot of it is based on this Gemara that we just saw, and to some large degree Rashi's Perush in the Ramban in Breshit, Perek Bet, Pasuk Gimel, Vayevarech Elokim et Yom HaShvi'i Vayikadesh Oto. There's a very long Ramban here, and this is where he fleshes out most of his opinion about it. And one of the other places which I mentioned before is where is in Vayikra at the beginning of Parshat Bahar, Perek Kafei, Pasuk Bet, where he talks about Shabbat Lashem. And here he also goes through, he expands on this a little bit. He refers back to what he wrote in Breshit, but he goes in the Perush on Breshit, he goes through the 6,000 years in a slightly different way than what we saw in the Gemara. He goes through millennium by millennium. And he bases it somewhat on the Gemara, somewhat on Rashi, and somewhat on, I think, on some other sources, his own opinion about it. But yes, the last thing I want to do, and then I'll take any questions or comments, because I promised we would do this. And I just wanted to show people back to Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat. One of the places where the Gemara talks about this idea is this Gemara Masechet Arachim, Daf Yud Gimel Amud Bet. The Mishnah here is talking about, excuse me, it's talking about the Avodah of the Levim Achaduchan, right? The people which were the Levim who were singing in the Beit HaMikdash, and it gives some details there. And in the context of this sugya, just a second. Actually, hold on one second. I think I'll put it here. The Mishnah here is talking about, right, like I said, you have to have at least 12 Levim on the Duchan to be singing, and then you can add as many as one. A Katan is not allowed to go in, right? A minor is not allowed to go into the Azara for service, except at the time the Levim are saying the shir. So the Rashi explains the Ktanim wouldn't say the Nevel Ubechinor, rather with their mouth, only with their mouth. Litain Tevel Benima, Tevel like the word Tavlin, Litain Tavlin Benimot Alavim, to give spice to the singing of the Leviim. Lefi Shekol Havim Haktanim Dak Metabel et Kol Halavim Hagdolim. In other words, they brought the young Leviim, the children of the Leviim, to bring in. They were the high voices that would harmonize with the older Leviim. Okay, so the Gemara here a little bit later. Right? So the Mema de Nevel Lechud the Kinor Lechud. So does this mean that a Nevel is one thing and a Kinor is another thing? So let's say that would indicate that our Mishnah is not like Rabbi Yehuda. The Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer Kinor Shemikdash Shel Shivat Nimim Haya. The Kinor that was in the Mikdash had 7 strings. Shinemar, in here, this is a bit of a rasha. The pasuk says, "Todieni orach chayim, sova smachot et panecha, ni'imot bimincha netzach." So the word is sova, which is like to say it. Sova smachot et panecha, al tikrei sova ela sheva. The drasha is you should read it as if it says 7, and the idea being that it's a pasuk that's saying that there should be 7, like these 7 strings of the lyre to bring happiness. Right, smachot et panecha, to bring happiness to Hashem's face. So that's the kinor that was in the mikdash. Shel Yemot Mashiach Shmone, that the kinor of the Yemot Mashiach that has 8 strings. So as it says, Lamatzech al hashminit al nima shminit. What's the shminit? So the drasha is it's on the 8th string. We're going to add an 8th string, and then Shel Olam Haba Eser. The world to come, there's going to be 10 strings. Shinemar alei asor v'alei navel alei higayam b'chinor. Right, so that's from Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat. Ve'omer hodu Hashem b'chinor b'nevel asor zamru lo. In the 10-string nevel, you will sing to him. Shiru lo shir chadash. You will sing to him a new song. So then the Gemara has to answer the question we answered that it asked before, but for our purposes, what the Gemara here is pointing out, like from Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat, Alei Asor V'lei Navel, Alei Higayam B'chinor, it's the drashas, it's an indication for, so it's talking about Olam Haba, because that's when the 10-string instrument is going to be played. And that's one of the rimazim in Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat that indicates that it's not about Shabbat Bereshit, but it's about a Shabbat Latid Lavo. Okay. There were 1 or 2 other things I wanted to mention, which I didn't take notes before I started, so I don't remember. So, but let's from my point of view, I'll stop here, but I'll open up if anybody would like to say, comment. And if you, I mean, right now I'll ask everybody to keep their comments brief, but if it's something that you want to talk about in the future, we can try to bring it up again. But go ahead, anybody. No? Okay.
Brief indeed.
Okay, so listen, just to maybe wrap this up for the, for our purposes. I do think that, and I want to bring it back to the context that we saw it in Masechet Tamid. So we went off on this very long tangent because we were talking about the song that the Levim would say/sing with the Korbanot Tamid in the Beit Mikdash. And it raised this whole question about what the purpose of the singing was. And the one of the things that comes out of it from the Mishnah Tamid is this idea is that for the Yemei Chol, they're singing, as it were, in praise and recollection of Maaseh Bereshit. But when it comes to Shabbat, they're now singing about Latid Lavo, to some time in the future. How we calculate that, it's not clear. And we didn't even get into this question about Abaye's Shita, about why he thinks we understand the biblical basis of Isis. There's maybe 2,000 years of Charuv. But then what happens afterwards? Is that literally the end of days, or does it mean that it's going to then introduce a new era, which we also saw indications for that. We also saw in the Breitza of that was brought in support of Rav Katina that this is also comparable to the Shemitah, And there are people who, when they put these things together, they also multiply the millennia, just like there's going to be 6 plus 1, that'll be the first Shemitah. But that would imply that there's going to be 7 more of them, and then there'll be a Yovel, right, which lengthens the whole thing more than 7 times over. We get to 49, 50,000 years. There are different ways of looking at it, but that's why I bring you the Rambam. The Rambam says nobody really knows. So like, don't worry yourself too much about this. You should be focused on the things you need to focus on, which is learning Torah, doing mitzvahs. Those are the things you need to focus on. These things will take care of themselves. But it's interesting to think that this was also embedded in the avodah of the Beit HaMikdash itself. And I think if you want to take the time and look at the Ramban, I think it's very interesting to see how the Ramban integrates many of these concepts to understand the relationship between Maaseh Bereshit, Shemitah, and then ultimately this Ma'amar of Rav Katina. Anyway, that's what I have to say about this. And thank you all for everything, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you. Good night. It was wonderful.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.